مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة الجديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. تقود الولايات المتحدة حراك سياسي نشيط في الخفاء والعلن لتجنب العملية العسكرية التركية التي قد تزعزع الاستقرار في الشمال السوري وفي سوريا ككل. كان آخر هذه المبادرات الأمريكية زيارة السيناتور والسياسي الأمريكي البارز لينسي جرام إلى الشمال السوري وكل من تركيا والعراق لمحاولة التوصل إلى حلول سياسية تجنب المنطقة المزيد من التصعيد. فما الذي حملته مبادرة لينسي جرام وماذا تحمل الولايات المتحدة من مقترحات للتهدئة السياسية في الشمال السوري؟ هذا ما نبحثه في حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين مع ضيوفي لهذه الحلقة، وهما السيدة ميغان بوديت رئيسة قسم الأبحاث في معهد كابي أو معهد السلام الكردي للدراسات في واشنطن وأيضا من العاصمة الأمريكية واشنطن. ينضم إلينا لاحقا عبر سكايب السيد ديفيد ديروش وهو المسؤول السابق في وزارة الدفاع الأمريكية البنتاغون. ابقوا معنا لمتابعة هذه الحلقة. أهلا وسهلا بك من جديد سيدة ميغان في استوديو نورث بريس في العاصمة واشنطن.
Thank you for having me.
ميغان، أنت من أكثر من يتابع الشأن السوري وشأن الشمال السوري تحديدا هنا في أروقة صناعة القرار في العاصمة الأمريكية واشنطن. كيف تقرأين وكيف تقرأ واشنطن مبادرة لينسي جرام، زيارة لينسي جرام إلى الشمال السوري والتي أتت بعد زيارة إلى العاصمة التركية أنقرة وأيضا زيارة أخرى إلى العراق؟
So first, I think we have to understand that it's a sign of Turkey's diminished stature in Washington that the best visit they can get is from a senator who is disliked by his own party, disliked on the other side of the aisle as well, and has been involved in all kinds of scandals and incidents that he's been heavily criticized for on both sides of the aisle. If that is the highest ranking and most prominent individual who can be convinced to visit Turkey and make Turkey's case for F-16 sales, for a more interventionist policy in Syria, that's a sign that there is growing consensus on all sides in Washington, D.C., that Turkey's militarist and expansionist goals are dangerous and are something to be opposed. Now, that said, I think we have to understand his visit in Syria as an attempt to rehash the failed Trump policies towards northeast Syria that led to the disastrous Turkish invasion and occupation of Serikaniye and Tel Abyad in October of 2019. In an op-ed for Fox News, while he claimed to care about investing more in the fight against ISIS, what he actually suggested were concessions to Turkey that we know led to the invasion that weakened the fight against ISIS and allowed ISIS prisoners to go free, distracted the SDF from their work fighting ISIS by forcing them to respond to the existential threat of a Turkish invasion. And furthermore, he's also recommended a very misguided and likely illegal policy of bringing Turkish companies in to develop the oil fields in northeast Syria. Now, as we know, the recent general license sanctions exemption for north and east Syria explicitly excluded the oil because of legal issues, but did put in options for solutions much better suited to northeast Syria, like green energy, more sustainable ways to address, the real crises and resources there that don't have problematic legal implications and that don't have a disastrous environmental impact, and that wouldn't require something as dangerous as bringing Turkish companies in that would exert an unfair and problematic amount of control over the economy and therefore the politics of the region. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a sign of Turkey's diminished influence, but it is representative of a policy in Washington towards north and east Syria that we saw under Trump was dangerous, destabilizing, and didn't actually do anything to protect regional security and stability, rather led to the invasion in 2019, to serious human rights abuses and to bad outcomes for the people of north and east Syria and regional peace and stability alike.
يعني أنت تقولين أن زيارة لينسي جرام ومقترحات لينسي جرام هي خالية من المضمون، يعني يقوم بتقديم مقترحات خيالية مثل أن تستثمر تركيا في النفط في الشمال السوري مقابل إرضائها وعدم قيامها بمثل هذه العملية. إذن يعني لصالح من هي هذه الزيارة؟ ما هو هدف هذه الزيارة الحقيقي إذن برأيك برأيك؟ هل هي لصالح بيع F-16 إلى تركيا، أم هي فعلا لخير المنطقة للتهدئة، أم أن لها هدف سياسي مرتبط بلينسي جرام نفسه واقترابنا من الانتخابات الأمريكية في الكونغرس الأمريكي في نوفمبر المقبل؟ ونعرف أن لينسي جرام دائما ما يطرح نفسه على أنه عضو مجلس الشيوخ البارز في بصمته بالسياسات الخارجية تحديدا.
I think it's obviously, as these visits always are, to some degree in his own interest and his desire to promote himself and be seen as doing something relevant on foreign policy. But I think if we take a broader view, which is very important, it is in the interests of Turkey and Turkey's attempts to get concessions in Washington on the F-16 issue, on the issue of northern Syria. I don't think that he's going to be able to do that because, as I said, both Republicans and Democrats take a very different position on the issue than he does, and, correctly identified the flaws in that concessions-based approach when it led to war in 2019. So I don't think that there's much buy-in to what he's pushing for in Washington. So in that case, I do think it represents an attempt to advance some of Turkey's interests against the SDF. But I do think that we have to remember that he was never acting alone. Trump was never acting alone. There is a segment among the Republican Party on that more hawkish and neoconservative wing of the party that wants to use North and East Syria to escalate against Iran, that wants to protect the relationship with Turkey despite Turkey's actions destabilizing the Middle East and Erdogan's crackdown on democracy in his own country, and that generally views the issues in the region through a perspective that is not conducive to peace and diplomacy. I think when we look at this in the context of failing negotiations around the Iran deal and statements during the Trump administration about using northeast Syria against Iran, which is something very dangerous, dragging the people of that region into a conflict that they did not ask for. I think that it may be connected to that anti-Iran, more hawkish and neoconservative vision as well. But I think especially now, with Democrats currently holding Congress, with Biden in the presidency, and even if Republicans do take one or both houses of Congress in the fall, I don't think he represents a majority viewpoint. I think that there's bipartisan opposition to F-16 sales.
نعم، سأسأل عن هذا الموضوع، لأن بعد يوم واحد من زيارة لينسي جرام إلى الشمال السوري وبعد حديثه عن ضرورة بيع تركيا F-16 كان هناك 10 من أعضاء الكونغرس خالفوا موقف لينسي جرام وقالوا أن تركيا لا تستحق حتى الآن الثقة بها وبيعها F-16. أي المواقف هي أكثر شعبية في الكونغرس الأمريكي؟ هل الذهاب مع هذه الصفقة وبيع تركيا F-16 أم الاستمرار بنفس السياسة التي تبعد أمريكا عن بيع تركيا معدات عسكرية حديثة؟
Right now, I would say it is the position that Turkey should not be provided with further U.S. Military equipment because Turkey is using this military equipment to inflame conflict and threaten different countries around the region. So there's a wide variety of constituencies among both parties that are very opposed to Turkey acquiring especially equipment as destructive as F-16s that could be used to further destabilize everywhere from Iraq and Syria to Greece to Armenia. We've seen a lot of advocacy around this from community organizations in the US, and we've seen consistent pressure from members of Congress. So I would say that in my opinion, I don't think Turkey is going to get those F-16s. I think that Congress is going to continue to really oppose Biden on that sale on security grounds and human rights grounds. And I think that if they do manage to block the sale, and looking at things like recent amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act, recent letters and statements, bringing up all of these human rights and security concerns in multiple regions, I think that trend will hold, and I think that will be in line with American public opinion as well.
حين قامت تركيا بغزو مناطق في الشمال السوري في عام 2019 رأينا معارضة شعبية وسياسية كبيرة في واشنطن والولايات المتحدة لهذه الخطوة التركية. أعضاء في الكونغرس، مسؤولين سابقين، مسؤولين في البنتاغون، بعضهم استقال احتجاجا على عدم تحرك الولايات المتحدة لكبح العملية العسكرية التركية. هل يتوفر هذا المناخ اليوم من المعارضة لهذا التصعيد التركي إذا ما أقدمت تركيا على عملية عسكرية في الشمال السوري؟
I do think that those options remain on the table. There are those complicating factors, exactly as you mentioned. But I think if we look at the scope and scale of the reaction in 2019 and the fact that conditions in the areas that Turkey took over have been as horrible for human rights and destabilizing as people predicted, they have contributed to a resurgence of extremist groups. They have been something that was as bad as even the worst critics at the time predicted. And the fact that Turkey's reputation in Washington, even despite its attempts to play peacemaker in Ukraine, has not increased all that much, especially with its interest in using the NATO accession process for Sweden and Finland to go after refugees, dissidents, Kurdish and Turkish people who had escaped persecution in Turkey to go to Europe, and that Turkey now wants extradited to go after pro-Kurdish protests in those countries, to even attack the leaders of those countries for meeting with people like Ilham Ahmed from the SDC or General Mazloum from the SDF as part of their policy towards Syria and their diplomatic and security engagement in those countries. By doing that, I think Turkey really destroyed any small reputational gains that it may have made in Washington for its role in Ukraine. And I think this all goes back to, and a potential US response to a new invasion would also go back to as well, the continued lack of a resolution to the Kurdish question in Turkey. Because as long as that issue is not resolved, Turkey will continue to have a threat prioritization that is not shared by any other country. It will see organized Kurdish political activity as more dangerous than Russian intervention in Europe, as more dangerous than ISIS and other Islamist groups. A report just came out in the UK showing that Turkey not only failed to prevent the Yazidi genocide in Iraq and Syria, but was actually complicit in ISIS acts of genocide because of its policy that saw Kurdish groups in the region as a greater threat than ISIS. So we've already seen that threat prioritization lead to Turkish complicity with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and to Turkey derailing the NATO accession process during an active land war in Europe. And as long as the Kurdish question remains unsolved, not only will it contribute to authoritarianism and repression in Turkey and to war in Iraq and Syria, but it will continue to have these big international implications. And so if Turkey attacks again, and it is once again a major international crisis caused by Turkey's authoritarian and militarist approach to the Kurdish issue, I think that not only will there be a strong response, especially after what we saw in 2019 and have seen in the 2 years since then, and shifts in public opinion on Turkey among Congress, among policy experts, but I think we might finally see more discussion of the fact that the Kurdish question must be resolved peacefully. Turkey shouldn't be able to pursue these wars in Iraq and Syria, locking up domestic opposition, targeting people who criticize Turkish policies, even when they leave to Europe. I think that people are going to realize that that's unsustainable. So not only will there be a strong response, but I would imagine that there could well be, and the most rational choice would be for there to be a response that tries to solve this problem at the root.
نعم. ميغان، الولايات المتحدة إدارة جو بايدن تقول لازلنا ملتزمين بالحرب ضد تنظيم داعش بتنسيق مع قوات سوريا الديمقراطية ومجلس سوريا الديمقراطية في الشمال السوري وإرساء الاستقرار في المنطقة. ماذا يعني هذا الالتزام إذا ما أقدمت تركيا على تحريك آلياتها الثقيلة مثل ما هي تفعل الآن أصلا، وتقدم على عملية عسكرية جديدة في المنطقة في الشمال السوري؟ هل ستتحرك الولايات المتحدة عسكريا؟ هل ستقول الولايات المتحدة لا نريد اصطدام عسكري جديد مع تركيا فتسحب قواتها؟ ماذا يعني كل هذا؟
No, the US will never clash with the Turkish military. That being, what we saw in 2019 with the US withdrawing, And even with reports of Turkey actually targeting US positions in areas known to be near US positions that came out in the media during the 2019 invasion, the US obviously responded to that by continuing to pull away. So I think that's a very settled matter, that that's not something the US would ever do. There would be no military confrontation. Furthermore, the areas that Turkey has been threatening now, Tel Rifat and Manbij, are not under US influence, they're under Russian influence. Now, Russia has demonstrated that it will militarily confront Turkey on occasion, though it also will make deals with Turkey to Turkey's interests against Syrian Kurds, as we saw in Afrin. So the Russian reaction could be much more flexible in both directions. We could see Russia responding to a Turkish attack if Turkey targeted Tel Rifat or Manbij. We could see Russia, and I believe they are currently now using their diplomatic efforts to do this, working to negotiate, to inform Turkey that there will be consequence if Turkey goes in, to mediate between the SDF and the Syrian government to prevent a Turkish incursion. So that diplomacy might be there. And if Turkey goes in and Russia sees Turkish intervention in Syria as a significant threat to its own interests in Syria, they may respond. So there's a wide spectrum of actions available to Russia there. The US will not respond militarily. The US would respond diplomatically and economically, as we saw in 2019. But there simply would not be any military confrontation with Turkey on the ground. And again, that's why, in my opinion, the best way to respond to this invasion would be to prevent it, to not allow it to happen, to put serious effort into maintaining and observing the ceasefire, so clashes on the ceasefire lines don't have an opportunity to lead to escalations. And again, as I said, to addressing the Kurdish question in Turkey and the domestic political reasons behind Erdogan's aggression towards northeast Syria. So that diplomatic route is the only way, and it would be better served if these diplomatic strategies were implemented. And to the Biden administration's credit, they have been both publicly and I'm sure even more strongly privately, informing Turkey that they're against this. But preventing an operation diplomatically is the best choice. And if Turkey chooses to go in anyway, which Erdogan may choose to do, the only tools that they have that they are willing to use will be diplomatic and economic ones.
أرحب الآن بضيفي السيد ديفيد ديروش، وهو المسؤول السابق في وزارة الدفاع الأمريكية البنتاغون، ينضم إلينا عبر سكايب من واشنطن. أهلا وسهلا بك سيد ديفيد. سيد ديفيد، تركيا تهدد باجتياح عسكري جديد للشمال السوري وتقوم بتحريك معداتها العسكرية الثقيلة نحو الحدود السورية من جديد. مثل هذه الاعتداءات كانت محط نقد شديد من قبل الرئيس الحالي جو بايدن حين حدثت في عهد دونالد ترامب. يعني حضرتك أتي من خلفية عسكرية، بالنظر إلى القدرات العسكرية الأمريكية اليوم على الأرض، أعداد القوات المتواجدة على الأرض وطبيعة هذه المهمة العسكرية في الشمال السوري، ما الذي بإمكان الولايات المتحدة فعله لمنع تركيا من هذه العملية؟
Yeah, well, it's not really a military problem. It's more of a political problem. So let me back up a little bit and kind of give some of the issues the United States has, bureaucratic issues in dealing with Turkey. Turkey in the U.S. government is viewed as part of Europe because it's a NATO member. So whenever Turkey is discussed, it's usually discussed in a European forum with people who are used to working with Germany, with France, with Italy. When you start to deal with Turkey in Iraq, Turkey in Syria, Turkey in Iran, you have to shift to the Middle East and you get a bureaucratic juggle there because the people who deal with Turkey on a daily basis are used to focusing north. Right now, of course, Turkey is critical for NATO expansion. Turkey's critical for enforcing the Montreux Convention, preventing Russia from reinforcing its navy through the Bosporus. And Turkey's critical in stopping Russia selling stolen grain from Ukraine. They've actually impounded a ship that was loaded up with Ukrainian grain and then moved for sale. So there's a lot of issues on the plate with Turkey politically, and the challenge is within the U.S. government, the bureaus that deal with Europe, where Turkey is normally occupied, people in Stuttgart militarily, at NATO, the State Department European Affairs Bureau, which is on a different floor than the Middle East Bureau, they're all focusing on Ukraine. Then you have the guys who deal with Syria, who are in the Middle East Bureau, who are based at Central Command in Tampa and not at Stuttgart in Germany. They're talking about the issues with Syria. And quite frankly, I don't think the United States government has a coherent strategy for Syria. I don't think we had it under Barack Obama, under Donald Trump, or under Joe Biden. So we have this broad idea that, our allies, the Syrian Democratic Forces, whom are predominantly Kurdish, whom the Turks consider to be the same thing as the PKK, which is internationally recognized as a terrorist movement. We have the sense that we owe them something, we should be supporting them, but we don't know how much we should support them. Turkey wants to go in, is worried that they're incubating terrorism and terrorist attacks in Turkey. And of course, the Turkish economy is plummeting. And one of the ways that Erdogan can distract from his economic nightmare is by bringing the country on a war footing against all of that. So there's a very complicated issue, but at its base, the United States only has maybe 2,500 soldiers in Syria, and a lot of those are along the border with Iraq or along the border with Jordan. So if Turkey is determined to do something, we don't have the means to stop them militarily, but I think we do have the means to engage them politically and sort of let them know that, the alternative to the Syrian Democratic Forces is either a resurgence of Daesh or perpetual Turkish military occupation. I don't think either one of those is particularly attractive to Erdogan.
نعم ديفيد، يحط الرئيس جو بايدن بعد أيام في إسرائيل وثم في جدة في السعودية في زيارة أولى من نوعها في عهد الرئيس جو بايدن، يقول أنه سيتعاطى مع عدد من الملفات والمشكلات التي تؤرق المنطقة ومنها الملف الإيراني. وطبعا هنا أمريكيا نسمع أكثر من الإدارة بأن هذه الزيارة هي أيضا لحل بعض المشكلات المتعلقة بالداخل الأمريكي، مثل مشكلة قلة الطاقة في المطروحة في السوق العالمية. هل بإمكان إدارة جو بايدن أن تأتي بحلول حقيقية لمشكلات المنطقة؟ والإدارة أصلا اليوم منشغلة بملفات أخرى وتعاني أيضا من مشكلات داخلية، أم أن جوهر هذه الزيارة هي فقط أمور متعلقة بالداخل الأمريكي مثل النفط؟
Well, it's not all about oil. That's a subsidiary issue. So in the G7 meeting, Macron and Biden discussed oil, and Macron made the point basically saying, look, these guys don't, they don't produce enough oil. Even Saudi Arabia and the UAE do not produce enough oil to solve our problems. And the real problem in Europe, which is, on the front lines of the Ukraine war, is actually natural gas. And Saudi Arabia, does not produce enough natural gas for its own domestic needs. So there's an issue there. But I think the primary issue is Middle East. And I think there's two factors. The first factor is, the Biden administration believes it is close to a deal with Iran, and it cannot have a situation that the Obama administration had, where you had outright opposition from Israel and sort of passive aggressive opposition from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the other Arab Gulf states. So they want to get full buy-in to this deal. That's the first point. The second point is, I think the Biden administration is having to backtrack from statements made by candidate Joe Biden, trying to desperately to win the Democratic nomination after losing the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire caucuses. It's the first presidential candidate in the Democratic Party history to lose those two and then go on and win the nomination. He was on his back feet, and he basically appealed to the left wing of his party by saying, we're going to isolate Saudi Arabia. We're going to make them a pariah. People like Lindsey Graham, who you mentioned earlier, said, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has to go away for his role in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Biden is basically forced to turn his back on his campaign promises on the left wing of his party and a significant part of the middle of his party, and engage realpolitik and face facts, which is, if you're a superpower, you have to deal with a lot of countries. Some of these countries are governed by unpleasant people. Many of these countries don't have a form of government that we think is sustainable or just. But you have to deal with them for bigger strategic interests. And I think the strategic interest here is finding a way to confront Iranian expansionism either in the context of a revived Iran deal, which may or may not happen, or in the context of more effective Middle East, inter-Middle East, Arab, and possibly Arab-Israeli military cooperation, so that the United States doesn't have to perpetually be in the theater there to solve their problems.
نعم سيد ديفيد، المسألة الإيرانية التي تتحدث إدارة جو بايدن عن معالجتها في الزيارة القادمة هي في صلب المشكلات التي تعاني منها سوريا. يعني إيران لاعب أساسي في الحرب السورية، واليوم التصعيد الإسرائيلي المتزايد ضد جماعات مدعومة إيرانيا على الأراضي السورية هي واحدة من العوامل التي تضاف إلى التهديدات التركية للشمال السوري التي قد تعيد سوريا من جديد إلى دائرة اللا استقرار والصراع، يعني صراع وتصعيد في الجنوب وتصعيد في الشمال. هذا يعني أن الوضع القائم المستقر نسبيا في سوريا سيكسر وسيتغير إذا حدثت الحرب التركية في الشمال وإذا استمر التصعيد الإسرائيلي ضد إيران في الجنوب السوري. هل سنرى واشنطن تتدخل لتلافي يعني انهيار هذا الاستقرار النسبي الموجود اليوم في سوريا؟ هل واشنطن بإمكانها التدخل بشكل مباشر لوقف التصعيد التركي؟ هل بإمكانها أن تتدخل لتطمين الجانب الإسرائيلي من ناحية الحدود السورية دون أن ينهار هذا الاستقرار النسبي السوري؟
Yeah, I think that pretty much everything the Israelis do in Syria, the United States may not be consulted on in advance, but I think that we kind of agree with them. In general, the Israeli involvement in Syria has been relatively limited. It has not been targeted against, the Bashar al-Assad regime, for example. What they have done is targeted Iranian agents and Iranian proxy forces that are seeking to reinforce Lebanese Hezbollah or Palestinian Islamic Jihad stroke Hamas. So they haven't, engaged against attacks against, armored formations, the Syrian 4th Armored Division, which is the military vanguard that keeps the Assad regime in power. What they have been attacking are specific weapons shipments, mostly missiles and drones, by the Iranians. When the Israelis said, look, the Iranians are using Damascus International Airport, and they bombed that, I think that became too visible for Bashar al-Assad. They had to protest and take some action against that because it really did expose them as complicit in these Israeli actions. But at the end of the day, both the Russians and the Syrians are complicit in Israeli actions. They've basically cut an informal deal where they've said, okay, you target the Revolutionary Guard. We can't really do anything about them because they provided the manpower, which was mostly Lebanese and Iraqi. They provided the manpower that fought, to save the Bashar al-Assad regime. So we can't do anything about them, but you can target them if you want to. As long as the Israelis don't target the Russians or the Syrians directly, they have a free hand in Syria. That's more of a Syrian-Russian issue. It's not a Saudi Arabian issue. As to your bigger question, will this lead to a resolution you also asked about Turkey in the north. I think we're conflicted on Turkey in the north. There's an inherent conflict, which is we did not have the manpower to defeat ISIS. When I say we, I mean the Western coalition and the Iraqi and Syrian coalition, but it was led by the United States. Nobody was willing to have the forces on the ground to defeat ISIS, to go house to house in Raqqa and other places, except for the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is ultimately a Kurdish militia at its core. Their price for engaging in that bloody fighting was, a degree of autonomy. And that autonomy is offensive to the Turks. They view it as a national security threat. So there's always been this tension there. And it's something that was papered over by Barack Obama and Donald Trump and now Joe Biden. But occasionally the Turks pop up and say, look, this can't exist. We need to go in. I don't think the United States is in favor of that. When Donald Trump basically said we're not going to support the Kurdish forces in part of Syria, his Secretary of Defense resigned. I think he was looking for a pretext to resign so he could maintain his viability, but that was his pretext. But, no American politician has said these are the borders of the Kurdish state in Syria, pseudo-state. that we're willing to recognize. Nobody's drawn those lines. So Turkey will seek to press against that and try to shrink the area that it views as controlled by an entity that's hostile to Turkish interests. But at the end of the day, what I'm describing here are patchwork solutions around the margins of Syria. Nobody, Saudi Arabia, the United States, even Russia, has a plan to pacify and rebuild Syria. Everybody's just managing disaster or contributing to the disaster in the case of Iran, but nobody has a plan to rebuild Syria.
شكرا جزيلا لك السيد ديفيد ديروش المسؤول السابق في البنتاغون، كنت معنا من واشنطن. وختاما شكرا لكل متابعي واشنطن أونلاين ونورث بريس. ألقاكم بعد إجازة قصيرة بإذن الله، وكل عام وأنتم بخير.